Boyd, I'm going to cover tree planting today, and there's a couple of issues related to tree planting that you might be aware of, uh, especially if you've heard me talk about planting in the last few years. And then we'll go over some tree-related internet sites, websites that I find useful. So, let's see. So first, this isn't a new issue, but when to plant. It is a little new in that it used to be nurseries mainly had stock available in the spring, and so it was natural to plant in the spring. Now it's turning out that trees are available almost year-round and certainly through the summer. So it's okay to plant in the summer, but spring is best, summer's the worst, and fall would be kind of in between. One of the main issues I see, though, is people need to be aware of when the trees they are buying were lifted from the nursery, because if you're buying a tree in the fall and it was lifted in the spring, that's not so good. If you're buying a tree in the fall that was lifted and stored well, again, it would be okay. But if it's sat out on a hot parking lot all summer, then it's maybe not so okay to buy a tree late in the season. And it's not unheard of to buy trees that actually were lifted the previous year and have been held by the retail nursery because they just didn't sell them. And I consider that pretty inadequate. Do you have a question?
Mike, the question I have is, do you want me to ask questions as we go or save my questions?
It's okay with me if you ask questions as we go.
Here, it seems like most of the trees that are bought and planted, most of them are going to be in containers rather than balled and burlapped.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're going to be relatively small trees in small containers. And so, you know, they may have been, hopefully they've been in that container a year, so that they're fairly well established. Otherwise, they're almost a bare root tree.
Yeah, and if they're not established, I think it's Utah Department of Agriculture rules that they can't call it established. They can't just stick a bare root in a pot, put some potting media around it and call it established.
Can they sell those in the fall? If they were planted in the spring, would they be established sufficiently to sell in the fall then?
Yeah, they might be. An awful lot of stuff, though, is coming in pots, grown in the pots for several years. Now, I don't know what the nurseries there are doing, but it's common to buy small and large potted stock that have been in the pot for a long time, well, several years, and even to have trees that have been grown in a small pot, rooted out, sometimes even got circling roots, and then are repotted into a bigger pot. You've got that zone of circling roots in a ways, and then you get more out towards the new pot boundary, and that's a problem. I'm going to talk about balled and burlap versus potted because I have some thoughts on that, on what's good to do.
So if you're planting those potted plants or the containerized plants, is this spring best, fall okay, summer not quite as good, still hold true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the reason the summer is the worst is because you've got foliage on the tree, and earlier in the summer would be worse than later in the summer. You've got foliage on the tree, and it's losing water constantly, and you're disrupting the root system. And you may lose all the foliage if you don't really take care of it. Plus, you have to transport the thing home with full leaf on it. And so that's why it's the worst. Later in the summer, the foliage is a little more hardened off, so it might survive. But the worst would be, kind of early summer as it's just leafed out and it's got really tender leaves on it. Then then you'd have real problems.
What about in the fall, maybe after they drop their leaves?
Yeah, that'd be good.
But the ground's still thawed, and that's
good.
not too bad, is it?
No. I also don't like to see planting in the dead of winter, which you mainly only see with
Commercial?
yeah, commercial plantings, because you end up with trees that often aren't backfilled properly, and just the holes not dug nice and wide, which we like to see, because they're doing it with a pick, you know, and so plus you don't know if the tree's in good shape till spring. Might be dead.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, talking about what to plant, and I've lost my bald and burlap picture here in the lower left. Let's see if maybe it comes. There it is. Okay, so we've got a large potted tree in the upper left, a pretty good sized bald and burlap tree in the lower left, and then a bare root on the right. And the bald and burlap, as you probably know, is a chunk of soil from the nursery the tree was grown in. They use a tree spade. They used to hand dig them, but now they use a tree spade, set it into a wire basket that's lined with burlap, treated burlap, and then bind it all up with cords and some nails to hold things in place, and that's that. The potted tree, what you were talking about with unestablished or barely established potted trees is a different thing, but the one you're seeing here has been in the pot for some time and has lots and lots of circling roots. In fact, on the side of that tree, of that root ball, you couldn't see anything but roots. It's just solid roots. And then the bare root is, that's a pretty typical bare root system. They're pretty small root systems typically. And the bare root I'll handle first. I think it's good to plant bare root if you can get them. They're easier to transplant, they're cheaper, but you shouldn't plant evergreens bare root unless they're seedlings, so very small, because they've got foliage on them when you plant them no matter when, and they're going to start losing water right away. So seedlings for evergreens, and then you can go up to about the size of the tree you're seeing here. So 1.5 to 2 inch caliper, the diameter at the ground line. I've planted maybe a 2.5 inch caliper northern red oak when I lived in another place, and it worked fine, and it didn't have much more root system than you're seeing there. I did have to stake it to stabilize it for a while, but it quickly got its roots out and did fine. You wouldn't want to go any bigger than that, even with a non-evergreen, with a deciduous tree, bare root. So then the potted trees, those circling roots can be a real problem. Potentially you're not getting roots out into the surrounding soil as quickly, and you're certainly not getting a root system that has anything near a natural form. And what you'd like the root system eventually to do is do kind of like that bare root on the right, where the flare roots that come out from the trunk go horizontally, and the point where they meet the trunk, that's the root collar, and you want the root collar to be at or slightly above grade. You don't want it to be below grade. And so the potted tree, there's a few things happening. Almost all the potted trees coming into the state have buried root collars. So the root collar I just described is way down inside that ball, and it was true with this tree. This was a tree we planted in a workshop, and we did root washing to expose the root system to try to tease out some of those circling roots and to expose the root collar so we would know what level to plant the tree at. And that root collar was about 8 inches into that ball. So what they've likely done when they grew it is, I'm told, is in the production nursery, they start with liners that are bare root, usually unbranched, small, 1/2 inch or less diameter trees. They pot them up. They put them a little deep just to give them stability, and then they put the potting medium in and pack it down. Then they go and they replant the tree maybe in a year or so and in a bigger pot, and they maybe bury it a little deeper. And so it's all a matter of the person putting the pot together and the tree together, just planting deeper to get stability. And a sign of that too is all the trees you're seeing now that are staked in the pot, and that again is for stability. So the root collar is too deep, and then the circling roots cause problems. You can imagine if that potted tree has maybe halfway from the edge of the root ball to the root collar, or the trunk rather, if there's another zone of circling roots in there, the chances you're going to grow that tree up in its final location and not have circling roots are pretty slim. And circling roots are a problem because most of them will die. Roots usually don't last very long, but a few do. Some of those will become woody and start growing in diameter while the trunk grows in diameter, and when the trunk meets the woody circling roots, it gets girdled. And that may be 12 years down the road. You can estimate it's going to happen a little before the trunk gets to be the diameter of the original root ball. And there's a way to handle that, and I'll talk about it in a minute. I don't think it's ideal, and therefore what I recommend is bare root when you can get them, or balled and burlapped if possible, and potted trees trying to stick with only smaller stock, and certainly trying to avoid trees this big, because I just don't think they've figured out ways yet to grow a good potted tree for several years in the pot. And so balled and burlapped, you're getting a fairly natural tree. Unfortunately, with a fairly natural root system. Unfortunately, this one also had a buried root collar. And I think that's happening because they're planting them in the field. I've actually looked at a production nursery in Sandy area that they plant kind of in a trench, and then they pull soil into that trench through the year or two it would be in the ground. I think to stabilize the trees, maybe it actually could be a cultivation thing, that they're just doing it to cultivate, get rid of weeds, but you end up with soil buildup above the root collar again, and you see how that top of that root ball is mounded. That's about how deep the root collar was in this root ball. So sometimes you'll see a root ball of a balled and burlap tree with a flat top, and that's probably a sign that it doesn't have a buried root collar. You'll also see the flare of those roots right at the surface. So let me go on. Let's see. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute, how to handle those buried root collars. So one thing that's mentioned a fair amount, especially with shrubs, is in old literature especially, is to deal with that circling root problem by scoring into the root ball. And you even see mentioned butterflying the root ball, kind of cut right through the bottom of that and up the other side and flare it out and put it in the hole that way. And that might work, but what you're doing is every place you cut a root, when you do that, one side of the root goes away from the tree. In other words, you've killed that root, and one side of the root goes towards the tree. So you're just killing roots. You're just cutting off roots, and they'll end up being organic matter in the hole. You're probably not disrupting the circling roots all that much, because what you've got still is circling. It'll start to bud out new roots from the places you cut. The live side will. But better to try to find a tree that doesn't have circling roots, maybe plant balled and burlapped or bare root, or with a small tree like this, root washing is an option, and that's where you, or even just teasing it out by hand without washing. With the root washing, workshop we did, we actually had a big tub and filled it with water and kind of used a fork, a cultivating fork, to pull out roots. But that big tree was so root bound that it took us forever to get it done. A small tree like this, you could wash it out really nice and then spread the root system out in the hole and let it go horizontal and then backfill and filter soil in around the roots.
So would you want to do that when it was dormant?
Yeah, if possible, you'd want to do it if it was dormant. I had a guy tell me that he moved many large trees. He was the city forester of Spokane, moved many large trees in full leaf, including a tree they dug up in their neighbor's backyard and cut roots and had a large plate of roots, like 8 feet in diameter, and this tree was probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter and 25 feet tall with leaves on, and they cut roots, undermined it. I don't know how they could have undermined it adequately, but and bare rooted it. They ended up washing off the soil, and then several people each grabbed a root and they walked it over to the neighbor's backyard. So he swears you can do it even in the summer. What I like the thought of with trees like this is to either do this before it goes in the hole or afterwards. You shave off those outer circling roots. And a thought I had, and I actually saw one at DI the other day and didn't buy it, was an old electric knife like people use at Thanksgiving with the turkey. And it probably wouldn't last long being used in this way, but that you could just slice down through those roots. Otherwise, it would take a very sharp blade because you're just going to push them aside rather than cut them off. So the other idea is put this tree in the ground and dig a wide hole, backfill so you have nice loose soil between the surrounding soil and the root ball, and then take a spade, a sharp spade, and just cut down through that root ball. You'll see the edges of it, and you're just cutting down just inside where those circling roots are, and just go all the way around the tree, cutting down the depth of the root ball. And then, again, you're just leaving those cut off roots in the hole. They're just going to decay and add organic matter, but the new roots that will form every place you've cut off a root that was coming out radially to the edge of the root ball, you'll get new roots budding out, and some of those new roots will head outward away from the tree. You still have a chance anytime you're cutting off roots when you're transplanting a tree, which is every tree, you're always cutting off some roots. Every place you cut a root, some roots will go out away from the tree, but other roots will go at right angles, so like a tangent to that circle that was the root ball. And even those roots, even if they go straight out away from the root ball, if there are enough of them going like this all the way around, you can end up with a girdling root situation. So ideally, we'd be growing these trees from seed where we want them to grow, but obviously that's not a practical matter. So I think this shaving off roots on the edge of a root ball like this is the best answer to the problems of planting potted trees that have been in the pot a long time. And I'll get to the bald burlap tree I showed a little bit ago and talk about the buried root collar in a minute. So here's a planting example that's kind of extreme in one way. They dug a really wide hole. And this might be what you would do if you had a compacted site like an old parking lot maybe, and you've stripped off the pavement or stripped off the gravel. And note that the hole or the prepared area is as deep as the root ball is high. You want the root collar at or above grade, and this is an extreme example, but you'd at least like the the hole to be 3 times the root ball diameter. That gives you the root ball itself and the size of the root ball on both sides all the way around. It gives you plenty of room to work, but the most important thing is you've dug up that soil and worked it up, so you've got a great place for roots to grow laterally from the root ball into the surrounding soil, and that's what's going to determine success in planting. So a wide, shallow hole, and here they've probably gone 6 times the root ball diameter. Again, this would be in an extreme situation where you had a lot of compaction. You don't dig deep and then backfill and then put the tree on top of backfilled soil, because where you dug deep, you've messed with the structure of the soil, and when you water the tree, the weight of the root ball will sink down into that soil you've dug up and replaced. So you'd like to place the root ball on undisturbed soil.
Another question here, I don't know if you're going to address it later, but is it okay then to remove the soil down to the root collar?
Yeah, and actually I'll talk about that right here.
Okay.
So in the potted tree, you're going to have a harder time with it because you'll have a lot of roots in there, but you have to find that root collar, peel back or just cut off what's above the root collar and plant at the level of the root collar. With a balled and burlap tree, it's going to be a little easier because often there isn't much rooting in that overburdened soil that's been put on top of the root ball. So in the picture here on the left, we wondered where the root collar was. Based on experience, I just knew it would be buried somewhere. And it turns out when you look on the right, that's how deep the root collar was. So as far as I could stretch my thumb and index finger, maybe 6 inches, and that's too much. The roots won't do quite as well because they're deep in the hole and have 6 inches of overburden over them, or even more if you put more on them, so they won't get enough oxygen. And also the stem of the tree, some trees can stand their lower trunk being buried and kept moist all the time, but a lot of trees, most trees can't. So you could do this, you could bury it and not worry about it with a cottonwood, a poplar, a willow, but with any tree worth having, you're going to bury that lower stem of the tree, and you very likely will get decay and wounding on that portion. It may already have decay and wounding if it's been that way very long in the nursery. And at worst, you should reject the tree and take it back, because having a buried root collar like this, even though it's common, matter of fact, it's more common than not, it doesn't meet nursery industry standards. So if they purport to grow their trees to standard, it's not up to standard. So we peeled back that burlap, and we just took chunks of soil, just peeled off the top, and we essentially got down to where if that root ball had been flat across the top, that's where the root collar was. And that's what you're seeing there on the right. We planted it at the right level finally.
Okay, so Mike, let me see if I understand what the root collar is. This is where you have the flare in the root because of the root?
I think you're back on mute.
I should be on. Can you hear me?
Still not hearing you yet.
My microphone's on, so.
Oh, now it's on.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand what the root collar is.
Okay.
It seems like it's critical, because if it's been planted, say, too deep,
yeah, I'm looking
it can
for a
produce
picture
roots above the root collar. Is that right?
If it's planted too deep, what?
At least some trees will produce roots on the stem above the root collar, right?
Right, and there's been a lot of work done on this, and researchers recommending what to be done. And one of the questions has been, if you have had roots develop on the bottom of the trunk, do you move up the place that you're calling the root collar, the place that should be at grade, and after you plant it. And I'd say if you have just a couple of small roots, don't do that. Go down to where the flare roots take off from the trunk, and those will be pretty substantial in diameter, whereas the roots we're talking about along the stem, on a stem like this, you might get an 1/8 inch diameter root coming out here and there. I'd cut those off. If you had more development, then obviously you've got a tree that could take getting buried like that, and then you might not want to cut all those roots off, and then you'd want to plant lower. But most times you're going to be raising the tree up. A problem with having bought a tree with a deeply buried root collar is if it's a bald burlap tree, when they dug it, the wire basket and the tree spade, it's all set up to dig a certain depth of root ball. Well, your root system, you'd like it to get deeper, to get more of those roots underneath. If it's buried halfway deep in the root ball with all this overburdened soil, they're going to dig just a very shallow part of that root system and leave even more of it in the ground. You always leave a lot in the ground, but they're going to leave even more. So you're going to have an inadequate root system. So if it's more than a few inches deep, I'd consider taking the tree back if you can. And this just drives home that point. Deep planting kills trees. Whether you're deep planting, because some people actually believe it's okay to plant a tree the way you can plant tomatoes, where you plant them deep and let the tomato sprout along its stem, which it does readily. Trees shouldn't be done that way because of the stem not being set up for it, lack of oxygen for the roots, and also it's more likely that you're going to get girdling roots like I talked about if you bury the root collar than if you put it at the surface. Because imagine this is the soil surface and you've got those flare roots coming right along the top of the root ball. If they're right at the top of the root ball, right at the soil surface after you plant the tree, it's hard for a root, say from this flare root going out away from me and this flare root, it's hard for a root to grow laterally here and go over this flare root because all the flares are right at the surface, and roots don't like to grow through the air and go over other roots. But if you've got them an inch or two deep even, then you can get roots crossing over each other, growing through the soil, and that ends up being a girdling situation. I had probably a 14-inch little leaf linden, and that's what had happened. It had been planted maybe 3 or 4 inches deep, and everywhere a big woody flare root had come out, a root from another root went sideways over the top of that root. When they all grew in diameter and then the trunk reached them, then the growth of that tree went from 12 inches a year to 8 inches to 6 inches to 4 inches. And by the time I did something about it, I was getting 1 inch of twig growth a year, and the leaves were less than an inch full size. And I excavated it with a shop vac and just hand tools and cut the roots that were girdling, and now that tree's back to normal. I may have to do it again with that tree eventually. I've also got I have 7 Norway maples in my yard, and they're very prone to it. And some trees are prone to circling roots and some aren't. And little leaf linden is bad. Norway maple is bad. With little leaf linden, I've had luck fixing it, but with Norway maple so far I haven't. Of my 7, I'd say 4 or 5 have girdling roots, significant girdling roots, and 1 is on death's door. And I've excavated its root system twice, the several feet around the trunk, and cut roots. It's a real puzzle trying to figure out what to cut and what not, because you can't always tell what's going to be critical and what's going to fix the situation. Okay, Poor drainage, aeration planting. This is just if you have a situation where maybe you have a high water table, or this actually was something I recommended when they wanted to grow more trees at a golf course in Provo area, a municipal course that was built on top of a landfill, and they had methane coming out of the landfill cap and actually migrating up into the soil, replacing oxygen. The roots would die, and they couldn't keep anything but a willow and a cottonwood going. And I told them either plant willows and cottonwoods or build berms, and they could actually have planted the trees, just put them on the surface, not even dig a hole, and build berms up. For the berms have to be large because you've got to have enough space for the root system to grow. But another thing they'd have to do in that case, because they've got the methane, they would have to put a impermeable barrier down under the berm so that they wouldn't get methane moving up into the berm. But you could do this in an old parking lot situation where you build berms and plant essentially on the surface, or just barely dig a hole. And if you really have a problem with drainage, you can always remove the water to a lower point if you have that option. Remove packing materials at planting time. That's an issue. A lot of nurseries in Utah require you not remove too much of the planting material because they don't trust the consumer and they feel like they'll kill the tree. Usually, probably most times, they are telling you to remove the burlap and the cords at the top, and they're telling you to remove pots. But often they tell you to leave the burlap on the sides of the root ball, and actually to fold the burlap down into the hole on the sides. But what I think the people who recommend that don't realize is most of the important root growth is going to go laterally from that root ball. You don't want anything to slow that down, and you certainly don't want wads of burlap pushed down into that alongside the root ball. So the thing to do is get it in the hole, dig a wide enough hole so you have room to work. If they tell me I can't get in there, there's not room, then they didn't dig a wide enough hole. And then use a utility knife and cut off the burlap near the bottom. The burlap on the bottom of the root ball doesn't matter. And for that matter, a pot. If you had a pot where a root system was falling apart and you were worried about removing the pot and then placing the tree in the hole because the root system would fall apart, you can always place the pot in the hole, pre-cut it partially around the bottom, and then cut up the sides and remove the pieces once it's in the hole, even after you've started doing backfilling. And people often ask about the wire cages. Don't you want to remove those? Well, those aren't really going to give roots problems. Eventually, if somebody digs up the root system and puts it through a chipper, I guess it could be a problem, but that's rare. But it's not the cage I care about. It's if you don't remove the cage, you didn't remove the burlap underneath the cage, inside the cage. So I want the cage removed only because I want most of the burlap removed. Backfilling, you need a hole bigger than the tree and then put in backfill soil, compact it, not too much. You especially don't want to get the backfill soil real wet and then really jump on it because you can push all the airspace out of it. But there are commercial plantings I've come across like this one where they dug a hole. I think they eyeballed the size of the root ball and dug a hole exactly that size and shape and dropped the tree in. Didn't do any backfilling at all. And this tree, you can see the wire basket there. You can also see the burlap. Some roots were starting to grow through the burlap, but roots don't grow well through air gaps. And so you want a wider hole that you put backfill in and push it down, push it up against the root ball to assure root egress. You can use the native soil on the site. If it's just lousy soil, You can use well-composted organic matter mixed into the soil. But you don't want to do that in just a small area around the tree. You want to amend the soil pretty far out, because eventually the tree is going to have to survive on the backfill you put in, and then on whatever crappy soil is beyond the backfill. If you can't really amend a very significant portion of the backfill, I would say just use the native soil, but always do as wide a hole as you can. I could actually put my arm under this root ball, kind of turn it and put my hand under and get my hand all the way to the bottom of the root ball. Staking, if you have problems with prevailing winds, the canyon winds certain parts of Utah get, that's something where staking is warranted. You want to leave it loose so that ideally the root system is being held tight, but the stem is being allowed to move, and that's a hard thing to accomplish. One way to do it is potentially drive your stakes right through the root ball, but then still have loose connections between the stakes and the trunk. And pieces of rubber hose don't really make a good loose connection. You can see how they're biting into that tree on the right. Wrapping is, you wouldn't do it if the trunk of the tree is going to be shaded in the winter. If it's not going to get sun, it doesn't need to be wrapped. But if it's going to get sun in the winter, then you want to wrap it with a light colored wrap, especially the rose family and the Prunus genus, so plums and peaches and apricots and cherries, ornamental cherries included, but also pears. Lots of the Rosaceae family have problems with southwest winter injury, and we did a fact sheet on that. Katie in Salt Lake County, or who was that with? Actually, I forget now, but we've got the fact sheet out on our website, forestry.usu.edu. Look under publications, and it talks about why this kind of injury occurs, and you generally put it on only for the first winter, and you want something that breathes, lets air in and out, and light color, because you're trying to keep the stem cold in the winter and moderate temperature fluctuations. You're not trying to keep it warm. Don't prune at planting time except for removing just broken branches or if something's diseased. I'd wonder why you're buying a tree with lots of broken branches and disease if you have to do much of that. But don't head back a tree the way this one is. Sometimes the trees come like this because they've been shipped this way and they fit better in the truck. But the tree's having to regrow new buds at the tip of each of those stems. So you've actually slowed down shoot growth and you've slowed down root growth because you've messed up the tree hormonally by cutting off those terminal buds. And so you'll get slower root growth, and you don't want that. Fertilizing, none ever at planting time, and then wait 1 year per inch of trunk caliper and fertilize only if needed. If it's a tree in a yard that gets fertilized, when the grass gets fertilized, that's probably all it needs. You can maybe force a little growth with nitrogen, but you really don't want to force growth early because the tree needs to establish its root system, and you don't want the top growth to outpace the root system. And then if you have a spruce tree that's growing 12 to 15 inches a year, a blue spruce, on its leader, and it looks good and green or blue, then why do you need to fertilize it any more than you already are? It's got good growth and doesn't need fertilizer. Mulch with organic mulch, the wider the area, the better. Rock is okay if it's that kind of landscape you're going for, but I prefer organic matter for most trees. It'll eventually incorporate into the soil and decay, and then you add more on it, and that's all good. It's not going to incorporate into the soil as quickly if you have a weed barrier, so I'd rather not use weed barriers with trees. Besides that, they're often not very effective. You get a lot of holes in them and tattered weed barriers sticking up through the mulch. That picture on the right's a mulch volcano, and you want to avoid that. Sometimes people get the idea of mulching, especially landscape contractors who are selling it as a service, and then they overdo it. Irrigation, water to keep the soil moist to the depth of the root ball or greater, and out from the root ball beyond the root ball. And you can use a probe if you don't have a lot of rock in your soil. They sell probes like this to find drain tiles and other buried material, and it penetrates a moist soil real nice, and then when it reaches dry soil it stops, so you can see how deep you're watering. Extend the watered area as the tree grows, so especially if you're using a drip system, you need to put more emitters on later and move them out and give more water. Don't saturate for long periods of time. And most trees, keep in mind that most trees need about 20 to 40 inches of water a year, most of the trees we grow, and few can survive in Utah without irrigation down at our lower elevations. So use that. You know, most of that's got to come in the growing season too. Water that comes in January only does good if it stays there until the growing season starts. Okay, that's what I've got for planting, and I thought we'd go over just a couple of online tree resources, and a couple will be just updates for you. The tree browser is now available on mobile devices, so PCs, Macs, but also like it works on my iPhone. And let's see, okay, so this is roughly what it looks like. You can still do the searching by characteristics, so you can select general characteristics, growth characteristics, ornamental, and tolerance of. General is like whether it's a conifer or not, hardiness zone. That type is the conifer. Whether it's Utah native or not, whether it has cultivars available. There's growth characteristics, so that's growth rate, mature height, longevity, power line, if it's okay under power lines, crown shape. You got to keep in mind that this is written for the typical member of a species. For example, Norway maple wouldn't show under okay under power lines. There are dwarf Norway maples that would be okay under power lines. And unless I've separated out that cultivar, it wouldn't pick that up. Ornamental characteristics, and then tolerance of shade, salt, drought, poor drainage, alkalinity, and transplanting. Okay, so let's see.
Mike, when I use the tree browser on my desktop, one thing that's a little bit annoying to me is if I go to select, say, characteristics, tolerance of, say, alkalinity or something like that, then I want to select another tolerance. Do that, because on my browser, I have to go back, and it seems like I have to go back to the beginning. Select like medium or high there.
Okay, I've got that.
And then if you want to select, say, tolerance to drought or something like that, yeah, it kind of closes, so I have to go back all the way. I'm sure that's probably done so that it works better on the mobile devices, but it seems like to me it's less useful. It's more annoying on a desktop.
Yeah, that's good to know. What it should show you is where you're at in the selection, that you've made one selection, now you're making the next selection, because it's pretty easy to forget that you already selected whatever we just selected, tolerance of alkalinity, I think, and what your selection was. I guess the only clue you have you've done anything is that this number has gone from 242 down to 234. And then we'll go to, let's see.
And I don't know if future versions could be built so that there's some place that you can see what you selected or something might be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and here's the narrowed down list, and we'll look at Italian cypress. By the way, this Italian cypress species, one of the, I'm not sure actually if it's in here. Yeah, here. Those are in Moab, which I wouldn't have thought it would be cold hardy in Moab, because normally you see these down in St. George, but I still don't think it would be cold hardy in Vernal, so I wouldn't try it. We have our Extension Forestry website. That's just forestry.usu.edu. I won't go there, but one of the selections we have is webinars, webcasts, and we've been doing more of those recently because I've got somebody hired to help out, a couple of people. The last one was how to talk trees to kids, project learning tree ideas. The next one's coming up in April. We've been doing them monthly for a little bit, and the recordings are on there. These are Adobe, I can't remember, Connect, yeah, which isn't ideal, but works for us for now. We have a Facebook page, and we're up to about 209 friends, and you can actually go on our website, and it shows you the most recent stuff that we've put on there, or you can go to Facebook and look at it. And we get quite a few. It's mostly aimed at like city foresters and just tree nuts. That's not to say nut trees. Okay, the virtual arboretum. I'm told by the end of April I'm going to have something to look at. We got a couple of the internal grants over the last couple of years to work on this. Maybe this one will work. So this is an example. It's using some open source software called Open Tree Map that was developed by a private company to allow this kind of thing. And it was Forest Service funding, so it's open source. And this is what my programmer is using to come up with the virtual arboretum. And the idea is it'll be statewide. You'll have a first page like this that'll show like the 10 most common trees in the area you're looking at, or for the state. Of those we've got loaded into the system. It'll show you, like in Asheville, North Carolina, they've got 6,200 trees loaded. Total benefits, and this is for stormwater reduction, carbon dioxide storage, water benefits, saving water, $138,000 probably annually. And they've got a problem here. They've got a $sign in front of their gallons for water benefits. But energy benefits, that would be reducing kilowatt hours used for air conditioning. We'll have estimates like that, but then you actually go to the map, and I'm just looking at all the trees. I haven't selected any. And here's the map so far for Asheville. And then you can zoom in on that and start seeing individual trees. And then you can actually go to a tree and click on it. If I can click. So that tree is a little leaf linden. You could zoom in further to see exactly where it is. You can view the details on that tree if there are any, and it's saying there's approximately where it is. They don't have any photos of that tree, but people who nominate trees for this can actually add photos that will be able to be seen by people, other people. It's actually got the Google Street View. Hard telling whether that's the actual tree on the Street View. Somebody nominated this tree, and there's information in it like that it's a little leaf linden, 6 inches trunk diameter, 18 feet tall. They don't have a canopy height. That'd be the bottom of the canopy. They have nearby addresses, but they're 35.7% complete. So there's other data that could be added for that tree, like photographs. I'm not sure what else. Canopy height, I guess, for their inventory. I'm not sure we're going to end up using canopy height. And people who enter trees in this can create an account, and then when they get some more information about a tree, they can go back in, add that information. We'll start out by having trees loaded from municipal inventories where they're available, and especially where they're spatially explicit so we can show where the trees are on a map. But also then other people will be able to enter trees. And this is for the city of Asheville, but the way ours is supposed to work is that it'll cover the entire state, and then you can go down to the county level or a city level. It's going to be a big job getting it off the ground even when the software works, but we're going to deal with that. Maybe another grant. Okay. I think that's most of what I had. There's, and I mentioned here master gardeners as possible volunteers to measure trees. I think some people would be into that. Here's some tree identification resources. ArborDay.org, what tree is that? These are actually a couple of keys I wrote for the National Arbor Day Foundation years ago. Now they've turned it into a website. There's a Western U.S. and an Eastern U.S. Frankly, I'm not all that thrilled with this because the key they made me write didn't include some trees that it should have included. And let's see. This is maybe locked up. Okay, but Virginia Tech Tree ID is really good. Their Virginia Tech Tree ID websites, and then the University of Connecticut Plant Database has a lot of really good stuff, including a lot of species we grow here. There's a Utah Vascular Plants website and plants database from USDA. I think NRCS is behind that. And then an online trick I wanted to mention. I've had people bring in plants before, like there's a bladder senna, I think, that's a weed in Utah, kind of in the foothills. And somebody brought that in, and I typed into Google a search that included everything as technical as possible as I could get. So it takes somebody like you who knows plants. I don't think this would work very good for a layperson. And I typed in bladder, legume, because I knew it was a legume. And I don't remember what I typed in about the leaves. I think compound leaves. And I did a long search term, entered that, and then went to the images tab in the browser and just looked for that plant and found it a couple pages down, clicked on it, confirmed it was a plant that grows in Utah and that it's a weed, and I had my ID, and really Google was the expert in terms of going out and finding all the possibilities, but I don't think that would work very well for lay people. And then finally, one thing I've noticed is when you're wanting high quality plant related websites, use a Latin name. if you can. That'll get rid of lots of the websites that are just crappy. So it looks like this is going to end in 5 minutes. Do I just push escape? Okay. So Boyd, any final questions?
I think that you've answered most of my questions because I've asked them as we went along. What surprises me is how much I can learn about tree planting, and I thought I knew pretty much a lot about it. But doing this, I worked at a nursery, and I've been doing this since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And but there's a lot of things yet to learn, and to try to transmit this to others it's just kind of overwhelming to me to have all of that, because there's so much to learn and to emphasize. So I know there are lots of fact sheets and bulletins that are useful, and that's great. We need to have those.
Yeah.
But it's kind of hard to cover in general everything that needs to be covered.
Yeah. Well, and this fact sheet, planting landscape trees, that Maggie Shao and I did before she left, it's our number 17 in our Utah Forest Facts series, and it's on the website. If you just search for planting landscape trees and maybe put SHAO for her last name, you'll find it. And it's got pretty much all this stuff about buried root collars and circling roots. It's too much fact sheet for a lot of people, but you can use it as a reference and then point to specific items in it for people. And we probably need to go through it and make 3 or 4 small fact sheets as well, covering specific aspects. Actually, JD is supposed to be working on one particular fact sheet that's just going to deal with whether you remove root ball packing materials, because that's been an issue with several nurseries where they're not honoring they're telling you they won't honor their warranty if you remove the packing materials, and that's just a problem. So we're wanting to get a fact sheet going, get it out there, reviewed and out there, so that we can then show those nurseries, okay, this is what Utah State University agrees on for this issue. So I
think these are all good, and this has been really good.